Hello and welcome to the first of the video lessons for the Britain 1900 to 1951 course. These, and you're going to get very bored of this warning, but it's the start of every single one of the video lessons. These videos are not the entire course. There's little point in me repeating loads and loads of facts which are easily found in textbooks. You have, if you remember, the textbooks which have been issued, as well as that on the K drive under History and Politics, LST, Lower Sixth History. I have scanned in a number of readings which will give you different levels of specific information. The purpose of these videos are to give you the analytical and conceptual ideas which are essential to make the leap between B and A star. In A-level history, the marks are purely above the B grade, looking for your ability to analyse why events happen, the causes, the counterpoints, the exceptions, breaking down definitions of success, and essentially explaining how things happen, as opposed to remembering lots and lots of facts. While facts are therefore important, they're not the real focus and shouldn't be the real focus of your revision. It's sometimes very difficult to get that analysis, particularly from the textbooks, who tends just to give loads and loads of facts and leave you to work out the analysis. The point of these videos, therefore, are for me to explain the complex ideas, points of analysis and counterpoints you could use or utilize in your exam. Now, you at no point will be able to cover everything I do in a single lesson, but this is to give you ideas, some of which you have almost certainly been taught by me before, some of which you may have forgotten, some of which I might never have said, etc, etc, etc. So the point of these is to provide an analytical framework as opposed to simply lots and lots of facts. So I will not be mentioning many specific examples unless it helps explain something or prove an analysis. So today we are looking at the first of the topics you could get asked in section 1, which is the changes towards attitudes towards poverty. I'm not entirely sure what happened to the formatting there, but you'll have to forgive me. Essentially, in the 19th century, there is an absolute lack of a welfare state. It doesn't necessarily mean there's not provision for the poor, but it's very much charity linked and therefore limited in scope, regionally dependent, and very often discriminating, i.e. certain people who deserve money will get it, other people will not. And so what we see is large-scale poverty of the bottom 20 to 30% of society. They generally congregate in slum areas, so very poor housing, very cramped housing, with landlords who are in just to fill as many people into a room as possible, as opposed to everyone getting their own house. And this therefore has terrible effects on the health, sanitation, conditions, quality of life, or life chances of anyone in this environment. If you want to show off, you can always point out that rural areas are just as bad, and for all the reforms we see, they are very much focused on urban areas, and rural areas continue to be in quite dire poverty well into the 1950s. The big reasons why there isn't much push for rural areas are, number one, administratively, it is easier to clear a slum, which has lots of people concentrated in one place, than it is to try and change hundreds of square miles of rural areas. It's just easier because more people are collected in one place. Additionally, there is some paternalism. It's the idea that the rich and upper classes do give some what can be described as welfare or support to people who work on their land in return for loyalty, in return for work. So there is a network which alleviates some of the poverty. If you are known as a good farm labourer or a good tenant, then the local landlord, the local farmer might give your son a job, and that will help alleviate the dangers of poverty, for example. And the last one is rural areas tend to be vote conservative, and because the Conservatives tend not to push reform in this period, what we see therefore is liberals, and to a lesser extent the Labour Party, who are making reforms, don't really care about rural areas because they don't vote for them. It's a bit crass, but it's unfortunately part of the political calculation. So what we see, therefore, amongst the poorest 20 to 30% are large families, people who work as unskilled labourers. Unskilled means that what they do has no intrinsic speciality. Anyone could in theory do it, and therefore because anyone can do the job, the wages are very low. If you have a skilled job, like you're the only person who can blacksmith, who can be a carpenter, you can demand higher salaries. So what we see is many of these families live in and work in areas which the industries are cyclical, i.e. Unemployment will regularly rise up as the industry fails or booms. So there are certain industries, as mentioned in the economic concepts of the first lesson, where there is a real boom and bust cycle. Loads of people want ships, there's loads and loads of jobs in shipbuilding. And then there might be a drop in world trade, therefore you need fewer ships to take the trade, therefore there's fewer people wanting to build ships, which means that the number of ships being built goes down, which means the number of people you need jobs building ships goes down, and which means loads of people are unemployed. Okay. Additionally, because there is no welfare provision, it means people who do not earn money themselves, so widows and orphans particularly, as well as older people, tend to have nothing which will help them give enough money to survive. Now in reality they rely on charity, but you cannot simply save up for a pension or live on your savings, because people in this era of that bottom 20 to 30% never have the income in order to save up for their old age. So what we see is, while upper classes have saved up for a pension or have saved enough money to mean that their old age is relatively comfortable, older people who are relying on, that can't have a job anymore, therefore have no income, widows who again generally have to stay at home, or there are less jobs opportunities, and therefore they won't have any opportunities to make money, and orphans, obviously parents, tend not to have any income. The state does not step in, and therefore these groups are particularly effective, and that will be important going forward, because these groups will be the ones who are really pushed and helped. So the big question we need to understand is, why isn't there a sense of we should reform this system before the liberals, and what changes amongst the liberals, and what changes amongst the left, and what changes amongst the reformers to change this mentality. So in the 19th century, the big idea is individualism. Both the liberals and conservatives, although they differ into what that means, believe that the state should be as small as possible. The countries run best when individuals work and are rewarded for that work. Okay? People should be encouraged to make their own minds up. They should not have to rely on the state, because that encourages laziness. I.e., so you can explain people not saving for pensions in individualist lines. If the government gives everyone a pension, therefore people don't have to worry about saving up for when they're old, what happens is people become lazy, they don't bother to make any extra money to save up for their pension, and therefore, because they know they're always going to get something from the state. You will make people work harder and more efficiently if people know they've got to save for their old age. That means they'll work harder, etc., etc., etc. Now, there are obviously arguably flaws in that argument, but this is what they believe. Individualism is absolutely key to understanding the right wing, which continues all the way up into the 1940s, 1945 era amongst the conservatives. Essentially, the state is bad because it encourages laziness, it encourages greed, it encourages people not to work as efficiently as possible. If people are left their own devices, unless they are morally flawed, unless they're lazy or feckless, they would logically save for their old age, save if they died and they needed to look after their children, or have their children and wife looked after, etc., etc. So by letting people and not having much provision, you're encouraging people to do the right thing. So this is, again, a slightly more extreme version of the current sort of right-wing, particularly economically right-wing ideas around free market economics. So the upper middle class and upper class and middle class, and many of the artisans, the skilled upper working class, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, the boilermakers, the engineers, all believe this idea. Partly because you can argue, well, this means that they have to pay less tax, and that's always good. But also, they believe that they have got their position through their moral standards, through their hard work, and that's why they earn the money they are. They are a success story because they are correct, they are moral, they don't drink, they aren't lazy, they get up early, they work hard. And that's why they have got that position. So they feel they don't want to pay their taxes and lose some of their money paying for people who, in their view, could work hard and make money but choose not to. Okay, so poverty is explained, therefore, is through the failure of someone to care about themselves or take the initiative and do something by themselves. Okay, and therefore, if the state gives people stuff, you're only encouraging people to not take responsibility for themselves, to be lazy, to drink, to fight, to not try hard, to not get an education. Okay, and therefore, logically, people who are unemployed, older, and to a less extent, there is more sympathy for widows and orphans, because that can, in theory, happen to anyone. They should have saved, and their failure to save is their own laziness, their own fecklessness, their own moral failing, because they'd rather spend that money on alcohol. There's a lot of emphasis on alcohol and that sort of stuff, on treats, on wasted schemes. Okay. Therefore, the poor being reckless has created this problem. Okay, and by having the state, you are punishing those people who have made money and therefore would pay tax by being morally correct, by working hard, by trying, by sacrificing, and you're giving it to people who don't deserve the money because they are in that position because they are lazy, because they are selfish, because they are greedy, because they are drunk. We, therefore, want a small state. And that is the logic of poverty. Poverty is a moral failing. There isn't so much about the idea of luck. There is a slight exception to what I hinted at just about a minute ago. There are some people who are who are perceived as more deserving, i.e. they deserve some help than others. So the working age man has no excuse to be poor in this mentality. He could get a job, therefore the fact he does not have a job, or the fact that he did not save for pension, etc., etc., is entirely his fault. He has no defense, and therefore he does not deserve, he is undeserving of support. People get confused by the way this idea of deserving and undeserving. Deserving doesn't mean they deserve to be poor. That means they are poor who are deserving help. So, and that mixed charitable letter is incorrect. So, there are some people who are poor not because of their own making. So, arguably orphans, widows, war veterans who are injured in war, particularly if they've got a medal. They are people who are poor, not necessarily because of their fault. They haven't done anything. Children are too young, and it wasn't their fault that they were orphaned. Widows arguably are dependent on men, so you could argue, and as many people have said, that the reason the widow doesn't have savings is because of the fecklessness of her husband. She has no say over her husband. The husband's decided to waste all the money on booze, and then he's died. And therefore the wife is left with a child, or 2 or 10, and to look after, and because of the moral failings of her husband, she and the children are suffering. So they might deserve some help as well, arguably less. Older people as well, even though they should have saved, there is still a little bit of a sense that they probably deserve, they are more deserving of charity, because it's they understanding it's difficult to save forever, particularly if you live to quite old. So what happens is the deserving for, not the latter as it says there, the former, deserving for, do get more charity and more help than the undeserving poor. It'll be very hard to find people who are seen as poor because of choice or moral failing, which is seen as the same thing at this point, they're not going to get out charity. So what we see in this period for the poor, therefore, follows that line. Now, the Elizabethan age, we won't get into that because it's dull, but the Elizabethan age pushed something called the Poor Law. This was a punitive act designed to punish people out of being poor. So the poor people are looked after. They aren't just left to wander the streets. The original act actually was designed to get rid of vagrants, beggars, who are causing problems. If you just punish them, they'll go to the next place and it doesn't deal with the issue. So the Poor Law was about controlling the vagrants so they're in one place, so not wandering around causing problems, but at the same time punishing them so they stop being lazy. Okay? As time goes on, and moral panics about how the poor are rising and increasing in size more than the middle classes, and also they're more feckless, then we see it become even more punitive, even more punishing. So, what the poor law essentially says is people cannot starve. We don't want to let people starve, and we don't want to let people wander around because that encourages criminality, particularly starving people running around. They might steal stuff. Okay. However, if you just give people who are starving food and shelter, then that will encourage more people to just give up and go to the state for food and shelter. Well, why would you bother working if you can get given this stuff? So therefore, what you need is a poor system which only gives in the very last resort. I.e., if you're a little bit hungry or if you're a little bit poor, it's fine. Okay, you don't get anything. But also, if you choose to take the poor law, if you choose to take the shelter and the food, as you can see by the two workhouses there, you must have an experience which is as close to punishment as possible. Only people who therefore are desperate would dare take it up. Okay, it's to discourage people from taking poor law. Now, this is designed to be as limited and punishing as possible within reason, obviously. So the people who pay for and organise the poor law stuff are the taxpayers. Okay, the taxpayers themselves are the ones who organise what people get for the poor law. So what ends up happening is these people who are paying the taxes want to spend as little as possible. So they're not going to give a lot of stuff, they're not going to help a lot of people, and it's going to be as cheap as it can be. So what we see is essentially the biggest thing, which is a workhouse. You get to live in a massive workhouse factory situation. You get fed, as you can see in the pictures, but in return you have to do punishing, back-breaking work for 10 to 12 hours a day, usually 6 days a week, very little freedom. It's semi-prison-like. Okay, it's very difficult to leave. Everyone wears the same uniform, etc., etc. You might get, depending on your means, that's what mean testing, depending on how much money you've got, you might get some tiny handouts from the government. That's more for orphans or widows and small family units, but again from the local parish. But therefore, again, they'll be tiny because the people giving the money are the people paying for it. So they're not going to. They're going to make sure that they pay as little as possible. This is the poor law, punitive, limited, because it's based on the assumptions of poverty. Now, the reason I have gone through this at great length, 17 minutes and 31 seconds, is because it is very difficult. It's very easy to get a C or even a B in this question if it comes up, but very difficult to explain the exact nature of why there is a shift in this attitude. Now, it's very easy to say. The B answer, the BC answer is, what they did is some reformers came along and they showed that there was poverty, and therefore people started liking the poor and therefore wanted to help the poor. That is all technically true-ish or true enough for an essay. It's deeply, deeply flawed on every level. And your transformation of your essay from a B to an A star is your ability to show how actually everything is a lot more complicated than that. Okay? Well, like the first thing is reformers show poverty, but people have always known there's poverty. So clearly they didn't show poverty. They perhaps provided a different narrative about poverty, as we shall see. Now, I am not going to go through all the statistics and facts about Booth and Browntree. You can do it at your own leisure. Okay? But what the reformers' true role is not to, almost like a safari, point out, look, there are poor people. Instead, what they are there to do is highlight and popularize the experiences of the poor. Everyone knew there were poor people. You cannot maintain an argument that Booth and Rowntree suddenly revealed that there is poverty. What they do is, in a very statistical, methodical way, they highlight the experiences with clear, populist, easy to grasp, shocking statistics. Okay, so they package poverty. Now, if you want to show off, you can always point out that reformers can reform what they want. They can make reports all they want. If people don't want to actually listen to this and don't in their own little way want to at least appreciate the idea that the poor might not be all guilty and all lazy, then you can make a report and no one's going to read it. Or if they read it, they'll disagree. People are very rarely convinced and have their minds changed 180 degrees by a report, particularly one report. Okay, people have got to kind of be sympathetic to the idea that actually maybe we were a little bit wrong about poverty. So what you can argue is that Booth and Rowntree certainly help, but what they do is they provide this report, this narrative that poverty is actually a lot more complicated than moral failing, at a time when people kind of want to hear that, because changes in society, particularly the increasing number of poor and experience of the poor. Mayhew, M-A-Y-H-E-W, for example, had been writing about the poor in London in the 1840s. Though Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens, not Darwin, he was a completely different chap. They are all popularising in the background, and what we see therefore is when these reports come, people are now willing to be convinced in a way that they perhaps weren't if Rowntree and Booth came in the 1850s. The people had not accepted in their guts the idea that perhaps this morbid poverty hadn't shifted. So reformers come at the right time. They package it in a way, they provide a focal point of attention, they start the debate by people, it gets in the press and people start talking about poverty. Okay, yeah. If people have got this gut feeling that, oh, poverty might be not so good, it might be not so bad, maybe not everyone's really bad, maybe we should look after, something needs to translate that into a massive change in policy. So what this does is, this decades and decades of this gut feeling, the reports come usually in short succession, and there's this sense of, now that we have a public debate, we discuss it in the newspapers, and as soon as you discuss it in the newspapers, more people are convinced, and you start pushing ideas of policy. The big thing Rowntree does, and Booth does as well, is they don't say all poverty is good, or all people in poverty are inherently good. What they do is they shift and undercut the argument that everyone who is poor who is there through choice. That's the key thing. They don't say that everyone who is poor is there because of circumstances beyond their control, but they almost pick certain groups. They go, look at these people that they haven't been there through choice, we should look after them. Look at these people, they're not there through choice. So what they don't do is change everyone's attitude on poverty. What they do change is people's attitude on how certain groups have become poor, and make people more sympathetic. Okay, particularly therefore encouraging the idea that perhaps if these people are poor, despite the fact they have not done anything wrong, maybe the government should come in and help. Gives a moral basis, moral argument that the government should be able to, or should encourage there to be some changes in attitude. This is not magic. If you say that Charles Booth and Rowntree equals people now like poverty, you are not incorrect, but you are not correct. You are certainly not getting an A or an A star. What you need to point out is actually what this does is some people are still seen as lazy, feckless, morally failing, and therefore don't deserve any support. And the government doesn't give them any support. Okay? Drunks, working class men in particular, they still don't have an excuse, and therefore they don't get nice things. However, if you imagine the group of deserving poor and the group of undeserving poor, some of the people who are undeserving, who don't deserve charity, are shown actually they're not there. They're not poor because they're lazy and therefore don't deserve help. They are there because of situations outside of their control. And so therefore what happens is actually perhaps they are now deserving. These groups are deserving poor. So cyclical workers. The argument is cyclical workers are undeserving poor because they should have saved. They know they're in the shipbuilding industry. Therefore they should save for when they don't have a job. Yeah, the fact they are poor because they don't have a job right now is their own fault. Therefore, no help. What particularly Rowntree looks at, and also there's a couple of other ones up in the north, is this idea that actually these people earn so little that there's no way they could do that. And therefore, we can't blame them for being desperately poor in times of unemployment because they just didn't have the money to both eat when they have a job and save money for when they don't. And so what that means is suddenly people go, well, actually, maybe these people deserve some handouts. Not all the time, only when they don't have a job. So the big thing what happens here is people don't suddenly think poverty is bad and we should all fix it. It changes the dynamic and the image that people who are poor, certain groups, are actually more deserving. Children are more deserving. It really pushes this idea that these children are raised in an environment and they have to go to a job and they have no choice. Therefore, they deserve help. This therefore encourages education. Okay. This attitude only reflects certain groups. If you are a male, you are not in cyclical unemployment, or you can still be blamed for your poverty in some regard, therefore you are not helped. Okay, drunks are still not helped. But people in cyclical unemployment, the old people who are shown that actually no one earns enough money to save for their old age, okay, the widows, the orphan and the children, people who it's politically popular to like and it's easy to get sympathy for, they increasingly get a degree of sympathy and therefore a sense that they should be looked after. By charity, yes, but also this group, since there's so many people now, can charity do it alone? And therefore suggest that perhaps government should get involved as well. Okay? You can argue that this whole thing as well, big thing it does is it provides a moral argument, a moral force, which therefore gives the liberals a cover to then make the reforms. Now, people who are convinced by this are naturally more left-wing, more progressive. So we're talking the moralistic liberals, we're talking obviously the socialists and the left-wingers and the certain groups of the upper working class who can vote. But the conservatives are not naturally convinced by this. The right are not naturally convinced by this. They cling on to this idea of deserving, undeserving poor, and this idea that actually most people who are poor are there through choice. But what changes their mind is a national efficiency debate. Now, you will all put the facts about 50% of recruits in the Boer War were too unhealthy to serve. This comes from a social Darwinist perspective. This is the idea that Darwinism, not Dickens, Darwinism is survival of the fittest. If you are an individual who is stronger, you will survive, the weak will die. Social Darwinism is the idea of looking at that mentality, but how it works in society, how it works broader in country level. So, i.e., if you look into it on a national level, you have all these great powers, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, etc. They are only as strong as their population is, as hard their population works, as orderly as their population are, as effective as their soldiers are. The stronger nations, so for example the Prussian-backed Germans, with their work ethic and strong soldiers, and their welfare state from 1871, well, roughly 1871, they will rise and rise. Weaker nations with less able, less effective, less hard-working, less skilled, less economically productive, and less able to fight people will naturally economically decline, and therefore militarily decline, and in the survival of the fittest on a national level, what happens is Britain declines, France declines, whoever it is declines. Now what happens is the Boer War really provides a focal point for this sense, although there's been a much longer term feeling that the poor are limited in their contribution to the state because of their circumstances. Okay, the Boer War really highlights this idea. People are social Darwinists in this era, particularly those on the right, because it also is used to explain why the rich are rich and the poor are poor. Okay, and so you believe, on average, person on the right believes in social Darwinism, or at least sympathises with it. The Boer War really hits this image that Britain is on decline because of the poverty, because of the weakness, because of the lack of skill, because of the lack of organisation, because of the unhealthy environments. The average British soldier, the average British worker is not as effective as they could be. They're not as effective at fighting, they're not as effective at working. They're not making as much stuff, they're not making it as efficiently, they're not making it as well, they're not making advanced stuff because they're not skilled enough. Therefore, Britain is on the decline. This panics the right to some extent. So therefore, there is an argument separate to the reformers, which is the idea that actually we should improve the circumstances of the poor in order to make sure Britain survives the survival of the fittest battle internationally. We need to feed our poor. We need to make sure that they don't live in so much unsanitary conditions, so that they work harder, they fight better, and therefore the country does better. This therefore is naturally urban focused, again because the idea of there's this image that the most corrupted people happen in the cities. Rural workers generally tended to be a little bit healthier because they had access to fresh food, and they often paid in fresh food, and they had slightly more healthy conditions, ever so slightly. And therefore, what we see is there's a massive governmental committee, the 1904 Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deteriorations. Feel free to peruse a reading for more details on this committee, who basically say we need to have a degree of government intervention in order to make the country stronger, in order to make the poor stronger. You cannot, though, forget that these people still also believe the poor are there because they are lazy. So they have to try and make the poor healthier, stronger, more effective, more skilled, at the same time as not encouraging them to be lazy. And the way you do this is you focus only on certain issues. You focus health, so sanitary conditions, public health, sewers, slum clearance, increase access to healthcare, midwifery, increasing that, yeah, which helps them make the country healthier and therefore more physically able to fight and work, and the young. Because the young aren't lazy yet. They might be lazy later. But if you let them grow properly, you give them health-based education, you give them free school meals, you give them good healthcare through school nurses, what happens is these people grow up to be relatively strong. Now, if they hit 18, or in this case 12, which is the school leaving age, and then become a lazy adult, well, then you're not going to give them any money. But at least they're stronger. That critical period in which they've grown, they're not stunted. Okay, so therefore we see the kind of policies endorsed by people pushing for national efficiency are different to those who are reformers. National efficiency are looking at health and they're looking at the young, whereas reformers tend to look for a little bit more broader groups of society. It is not an accident that education policy is far more closely aligned to national efficiency than it is about reform. Okay, you need to explain, always focus on this idea, like they are clearly more focused on changing schools to make them people healthier and able, and more effective in terms of part of the body politic, as opposed to being able to be more educated so that they can take middle class jobs as clerks. We don't care about that. The last force, arguably, is the fear of socialism. The working class vote is increasing as time goes on. 1867 being one of the big acts of doing it. There's ones in the 1880s, and slowly more and more working class people are climbing up the social ladder to be eligible for the property requirement to vote. There is also a feeling that at some point that we are going to see more enfranchisement of the poor. There's also a fear of socialism rising across Europe at this point. There's a lot of radicalist socialist action in this early period, and therefore there is this real fear that socialism will come and be a revolutionary force. Now, the Conservatives tend to view the rise of socialism as a bad thing, and therefore what needs to be happening is we need to crack down on socialism. We need to crack down on unions, we need to crack down on all the things which organise socialism, we need to crack down to, on the most extreme end, on socialist parties, although most Conservatives don't push that so much, Conservative individuals don't push that more, but they are essentially saying, to fix this rise of socialism, we need to crack down. Liberals, however, have a bit more of a challenge. Number one, they are the party of political freedom, so it's more difficult for them to justify cracking down on ideas, because they were once, well, if not cracked down on, at least disadvantaged. Additionally, they are seeing the rise of the working class vote as increasingly being a threat. They have a very broad coalition. They have middle-class, laissez-faire liberals, who are almost economic liberals, and they naturally, because they are not the Tories, get the poor vote. However, there is increasing agitation on the poor groups to make a different working-class party. If this happens, this will doom the liberals. They know this. and we're going to go into much more detail later, but essentially liberals go, we need to make sure that we stop the rise of socialism, and particularly the rise of a socialist party. So, what we see, therefore, is the Liberal Party decides that it might have to adopt a more positive view on socialism in order, and particularly more positive view on the poor, in order to make itself look more poor people friendly. If it looks more poor people friendly, then these poor people go, oh yeah, they're doing nice things for us, and so I will not vote for the Labour Party, which was looking like it was emerging at this point. In 1900, LRC is formed. So the Liberals, because of the rise of socialism, are forced to the left to make changes about their view of poverty. And because they are Liberals, they cannot simply go full socialist, because then they'll lose their middle class base. And this is the big theme at Liberals. They are essentially representing a very extreme range of right, so very centre right, even middle class people, all the way to the most poorest, most radical of the working classes. That is impossible, arguably, but this is what they're trying to do. So they need to have a way of giving enough change for poor people so poor people feel like the party's helping them, but at the same time not going too far that they scare off the middle classes. And they look at the deserving, undeserving stuff, particularly after reformers have changed the ideas of deserving and undeserving, and realise that's quite a nice middle ground. We still think there is deserving and undeserving. That's how we keep the middle classes happy. And we still think we want to do a minimal amount as possible to keep the middle classes happy. But we do want to do more. Particularly the government wants to do more in order to help the poor. And that's seen as a happy middle way. Now, we will look at that in a lot more detail next lesson when we look at new liberalism, but that is the essential origin of new liberalism. Okay. Essentially, these things do not combined change people to make them massively sympathetic about the poor. Arguably, we've never had a period in history where people default assume all the poor are there by accident, or all the poor. There's always been this trend of, well, yeah, but these people are there because they're on drugs, they're lazy, or whatever. Okay. What has happened, though, is two major things. Number one, the groups who are considered as deserving poor, people who deserve help because their poverty is not always or entirely of their own making, increases. And because we have more people who deserve help and charity won't be enough, therefore the government needs to do more to help them. So what the reformers do is they make the idea that people who are poor, and particularly certain groups, need help, but at the same time they also legitimise the idea that government should get involved. However, what this debate does not do is actually agree, okay, what should be changed, i.e. do we focus on helping young people, do we focus on cyclical unemployment, do you think something old? How do you do it? Do you give them handouts? Do you make them do a punitive thing? How far should you help them? And why you are even doing it? Are we doing it for national efficiency because then you do certain things but not others? Are you doing it for reforms for certain things and others? Or are we doing it for political reasons so that we stop socialism from happening? And they only do different things. So there is absolutely no agreement what you are meant to do, how you are meant to do it, how far it's meant to go, and what the provision is. So you can argue, therefore, that even the Tories have accepted, even on the basis of national efficiency, some change, but their attitudes about what should be done, how it should be done, the extent should be done, are still radically different to the Liberals, who also think there needs to be change, but for different reasons. Okay? One or two last things. A good case study of this division is the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws. Okay, 1905, led by the Conservatives in order to try and get a populist zeal, doesn't work for them. Influenced because the Conservatives lose office in 1906 by the Liberals. There are a broad range of supporters, from Lord Hamilton, who's a significantly powerful Liberal, to Beatrice Webbs and a couple of others who are Fabian socialists, who, if you don't know who they are, that'll be on a later lesson. In 1909 they respond, and the interesting thing of this response is that you can use it as evidence to show that although people agree that there needs to be a response, there is a difference to the extent, role of the state, and the reasons for reform. They end up not agreeing on what the report is going to be. So then they have two reports: the majority report with 14 supporters, and the minority report with 4 supporters, including Beatrice Webb, and the other supporters are all socialists. The majority report is very standard, as we've been saying, and bearing in mind the Liberals are in the majority report. The poor law will be extended. It will therefore still be punitive. It will be greater, okay, and ultimately, there is still the assumption that the causes of distress are not only economic and industrial. In origin and character, they are largely moral. So there is an acceptance there that some of the problems which people have, okay, and some groups more so than others, are because there are economic problems and there are problems in the industry. That means they don't have a job. That means they don't have much money. But still, there are people who are poor because of their moral failures. Okay, so therefore all we can see there, and the majority report is saying, there is still deserving and undeserving poor. People who are poor are often still there because they are lazy, feckless, morally flawed, or whatever. Nothing has changed in the attitude. Perhaps the arguments for national efficiency has meant you still have to do something, or the argument about socialism means you still have to do something, or perhaps you go, yeah, this is true for everyone, but not these guys. These guys are actually quite cool, they're fine, they don't deserve it, let's help them, etc. The minority report is very socialist in its approach. The problems that people have, the poverty people have, are caused by the economy, unemployment, depression, etc. This is not their fault, they're poor, and therefore to help the poor, what you need to do is the state needs to get involved. As you can imagine, what ends up happening, although there is elements of the minority report, the majority report is what is more reflected in government action. So when you explain, and we get onto reforms, why the reforms are so limited, because ultimately they don't change a great deal, you really need to focus on this idea. They don't intend to fundamentally create a welfare state. They intend to extend the idea of the poor law, capture groups who now believed they are actually deserve it rather than before they didn't think they deserve, and to fundamentally still encourage individualism as opposed to collectivism, the idea that the society should help its own, which is that being pushed by the minority report. So, therefore, because of the changes in attitudes, we will see a shift in government action. But because people fundamentally believe that we still want to encourage individualism, we don't want to cost it too much money, there are many people who believe in this idea that we should be changed, don't actually believe the poor deserve help. They just want to help them because that way the country isn't weakened. Okay, and the idea that there are still undeserving poor, and people are there for moral reasons. All these things mean that you're only going to do little bits, step by step. You're going to go on the low-cost side. You're not going to spend lots and lots of money. But more than that, you will put a lot of rules, a lot of things in place to make sure that people who don't deserve the money don't get it. Okay. Because the system is not seen as massively problematic, it just needs to be extended. The old system continues, but is extension. And you can argue there also is increased encouragement on charity work to fill the gap. So what we see is, although people's attitude to poverty is technically nicer and more inclusive of certain groups, it has not significantly changed about the explanation of why it happens. There are just slightly more goodies, and there is a slightly more grudging, well, even if they did it their own fault, we still need soldiers to die in the Somme for us, so let's make them have a little bit more nice things, and so they die in the Somme for us, but in a slightly more healthy way. That combined encourages a reform. This is a very complicated thing. These video lessons are pitched at this AA star level. Okay. If in doubt, if you haven't got these ideas, please repeat it. Also come and see me and I'll happily describe and explain ideas in my typically lucid way. But from that, next we're going to look at New Liberalism, which goes on directly from this. So until then, see you later.